founder of Nuclear for Australia. Thank you for joining us this evening for our Melbourne event on our National Nuclear Tour with nuclear engineer and Miss America 2023, Grace Danke. For those of you who aren't familiar with Nuclear for Australia, we're a non-partisan organisation with over 80,000 supporters. Our goal is to share facts and information about nuclear science and technology, and we advocate for Australia to embrace nuclear power. We exist to enable civil debate. Tonight we value that all of you have purchased tickets and have taken time to join us, and we want to respect that. Whether you agree or disagree, we want to ensure that tonight is safe for everyone joining us. And the last thing I would add is I am aware that a few of you had a few issues with entering the venue, and we apologise for some of the delays that caused. We hope that all of you have been able to make it through safely, and that is hence why we decided to start the event slightly later. Now, on to introducing our speaker for tonight's event, Grace Danke. Now, please give me a moment because, as all of you would be familiar with, Grace is fairly accomplished. It's not often that you find an athlete, engineer, musician, and a former Miss America all in one. Grace breaks misconceptions surrounding nuclear energy. During her year as Miss America 2023, Grace was named the new face of nuclear energy by the Wall Street Journal and was on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for energy. While completing approximately 435,000 kilometres of travel, she finished her undergraduate degree in nuclear engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Since passing on the title of Miss America, Grace continues to advocate for the peaceful purposes of the atom while inspiring the next generation of scientists, engineers, and mathematicians. In March 2024, Grace began work as a nuclear fuels engineer and a clean energy advocate at Constellation, which manages the largest fleet of nuclear plants in the United States. Outside of the nuclear industry, Grace is an avid water skier, classical violinist, and travel enthusiast. Please give it up for nuclear engineer and Miss America 2023, Grace Danke.
Wonderful to be here tonight, and I am so excited. So one thing that you're going to learn about me very quickly is I love to tell stories, and I love to have a little bit of feedback from the audience too. So I invite reactions. I invite some of that. So one of the most common questions that I get is, how the heck did you become a nuclear engineer? There's a lot of other things that went on in my life that are not tied to engineering, let alone nuclear in any capacity, right? So how did this happen? Now, I was a 16-year-old teenage girl who had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, as I'm sure most 16-year-olds have no idea what they want to do with their lives. Did you guys know what you wanted to do with your life when you were 16 years old? No, absolutely not. If anybody did, there's been one person so far that raised their hand and actually is doing what they thought they would be doing when they were 16 years old. Things always change, right? Do you? Oh, do? Oh, bro, high five. You got it. You're better than all of us. All right. No. So at this point in time, I was sitting at a family holiday dinner on Thanksgiving, so it's at the end of November, and we're eating turkey and ham, and we've got mashed potatoes and corn and all this stuff. And you know when you've got those family holiday dinners, it's like your great aunt and your grandma, and you haven't seen them in a year, but they're gonna sit there and be like, hey, you don't own a house yet. What are you doing with your life? You don't have a marriage yet and you're 16 years old. What's wrong with you? And it's like, Grandma, it doesn't work like that. And then they go through and continue to drill you about everything about your life. And you're like, I'm just trying to live day by day, okay, Grandma? That was a very overwhelming moment, right? But I really thought to myself, you know what? I'm about to go to college, to university. My grandma's right. It's time I start figuring it out and getting my life together here. So I looked at what I enjoyed in school. My two favorite subjects were math and science. And the reason I liked math and science is because I'm either right or I'm wrong. There's no in between. I hated getting an English paper back, and they'd be like, you're so close, you're almost there, just give it a little bit more. I'm like, what do you mean? If I write more words, you're just gonna be like, you're over the word count, so what do you mean now? And that frustrated me. So I knew I liked math and science. I was also very fortunate and blessed. My dad was a civil engineer. So he would take all three of us kids out to construction sites. We'd watch bridges get demoed. We would watch these bridges get built. And I loved it because I saw my dad using math and science to help people live their everyday life. He used math and science to do good in the world. You know, it's not just, all right, so-and-so went to the grocery store and bought 86 watermelons. He lost 4 watermelons. You know, it's actually useful. Never thought I'd be saying that, but I saw my dad doing good in the world. People could drive their kids to school. They were able to get to the grocery store. They were able to go to the lake. We don't have beaches where I'm from in the upper Midwest. I'm very jealous of the beaches here in Australia. But now because of that, I said, okay, I think I'm going to look at engineering. My love for math and science and my experience seeing him do his role. And at this point in time, I had about 1 year left of high school. And during that time is when you're applying to universities and you're touring colleges, touring these universities. And my mom and I go on a road trip to tour universities. And we drive from Wisconsin, the upper Midwest, all the way down to Texas. So about a 24-hour drive. It's very natural for Midwesterners to just drive for long distances. And I was specifically at Texas A&M. Okay, I always pause, even internationally, because like people have a really intense university patriotism in America, and Texas A&M is one of the strongest, like, rah-rah, okay? So I always pause, just in case. But I was at Texas A&M and looking down the list of different types of engineers. And I'm at the top of the list, and I see mechanical engineering. Now, my 16-year-old brain is looking at this, okay? My wisdom, not very high, you know? I wasn't the smartest, okay? Mechanical engineering. That's too basic. Everybody does mechanical engineering. I don't want to do that. I want to do something cool. All right, so I get to the next one on the list, and I'm like, electrical engineering? My brother went into electrical engineering. There is no way I'm following in his footsteps again. Absolutely not. Okay, so I look at the next one on the list. I see civil engineering. I'm like, yeah, that's cool what my dad did, but like he just kind of pushed dirt around. So like I'm looking for something more. Any civil engineers in the audience? Do you guys like pushing dirt around? Is it cool? It's awesome. I honestly give all the respect to civil engineers because you guys do some incredible work. Every single type of engineer is so crucially important. So this is not meaning any less of any type of engineer. Now, I get to nuclear engineering on this list. And now keep in mind, all I know about nuclear science at this point in time is bombs from World War II history class. And I thought to myself, there's maybe 2 nuclear reactors in all of the United States. Maybe 2. But I look at nuclear engineering and I think to myself, man, what a flex it would be to say, I'm a nuclear engineer. Huh. The other option was rocket scientist. So I was going either nuclear or aerospace engineering. And now I go back home, and I'm talking with my dad. And you know, my dad is taller than I am. He's very tall, stands about yay high. And he's got his parent voice on. How many parents do we have in the room? Do you guys have parent voices? Yeah, I know you guys know what I'm talking about. So I'm standing there talking to him, and he's got his arms crossed. And I go, okay, Dad, you know, I'm thinking about either nuclear or aerospace engineering. You've had a good career. Please tell me, what do you advise? And he looks at me and he goes, Grace, don't go into nuclear. There's no future there. Follow-up question for the parents in the room. What does a teenage daughter do when you tell her not to do something? She goes and does it. So I didn't promise that this was going to be a good inspirational story. I don't have a great origin story, right? I got into nuclear engineering out of spite against my father. That is the reason I selected it on my college application. That's it. But the reason I stayed in nuclear engineering is totally different. Because I actually learned, right? Realistically, I knew going into my first year of university that if my dad was right, I could always transfer majors. I could move into mechanical engineering or go be a civil engineer or whatever. But that first semester in school completely changed my perspective on nuclear science as a whole. It went from something that I barely knew anything about to something that I saw in my every single day life. It's all around us. Indeed, there is more than 2 reactors in America. As of today, there's 94. Creates 20% of the United States electricity and has been for about 60 years. That's a lot of electricity. Yet I didn't know that that's where our power came from. I didn't know that that was a strong, reliable source of energy for America. Okay, well, I kept learning, went back to class, kept going. What else does this have to offer, right? Let's talk about nuclear medicine. My dad's alive today because of nuclear medicine. He's a 2-time cancer survivor. He's happy, he's healthy, he's retired now. He sends me the weirdest Facebook articles at 3 a.m. in the morning, and I'm like, you've got to stop this, Dad. It's okay. The time zone, it's kind of funny because now I get them at a normal time right now when I'm in Australia. It's great. But that was the best I told you so moment, going back to my dad and saying, you thought there was no future in nuclear? Buddy, you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't have a future. It was, I promise, much kinder than that. My dad and I have a very fun, loving relationship, okay? But seriously, that hits a lot closer to home. Because I can promise every single one of us in this room knows someone who has cancer, who had it, whether they made it through or not. That hits a lot closer to home. In my everyday life, I found out that bananas are radioactive. How many of you have eaten a banana in the past week? Congratulations, you just ate more radiation than you would get from living next to a nuclear power plant for a year. And you're still fine, I promise, it's okay. How many of you like avocados? They're radioactive too. Smoke detectors in your home? Wildfires are a problem here in Australia. Every single one of you should be raising your hand. That scares me. There was some nods, but I want commitment on that one. Safety first, guys. Smoke detectors use radiological isotopes. If you have granite countertops, they're radioactive. Nuclear science is quite literally all around us in this world. And to me, I saw this as a way of, wow, this science that there isn't support, there isn't this strong knowledge about it, it's already doing this much good in the world. Imagine how much more good it could do if we supported it, if we gave it that public thumbs up. And that's why I started really talking about it as a freshman in college who got into this field out of spite against my father, right? Now, throughout this time, I'm also going through the wonderful joys of growing up and realizing the not joy of paying bills. Hate that, don't recommend it, don't do, pay your bills, but not fun. Anyways, tuition bills are very, very expensive in America, and I was seeking out scholarship opportunities to help pay for my education. And that's how I went back to the Miss America organization and started competing. Now, I was competing and I became a local title holder, and part of the program is having a social impact initiative. For me, it was educating Americans about their energy bill, that it's not just a bill at the end of the month, they have the ability to use their voice to change that bill at the end of the month. Let's talk about where their electricity comes from, and let's talk about where they want it to come from, right? So that was my platform going into it, my social impact initiative. It sounds so fancy, right? And I remember I'd go back to my hometown, I'd speak with my local high school, I'd speak with business clubs, I'd go to my local politicians, sometimes even the state level politicians, and I thought, okay, let's talk about nuclear energy. Let's talk about this awesome science that's continuously underestimated in the world. Let's talk about the positive that it can bring to every community. And we had those conversations. I learned from them just as much as they may have learned from me. And I'm thankful for those conversations. Now, I had a certain experience that I was, in my little crown and sash and everything. And I'm standing up on a stage and I go, hello everybody, my name is Grace Stanke. I'm a nuclear engineering student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm Miss Madison 2020, and I'm here to talk about powering our future with nuclear energy, yada, 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 all that good stuff, okay? Now the event happened that night, we finished up, and afterwards everyone's socializing and chatting. And I had this one gentleman come up and tap me on the shoulder. And he goes, Grace, are you really a nuclear engineer? That's always a fun one, right? When somebody comes at you with that tone of voice and you're like, okay, buddy, really? But in my mind, I say, okay, Grace, this is an opportunity. And I'm ready to turn around and say, yes, sir, I am a nuclear engineering student. However, let's talk about why nuclear energy is safe, it's effective, it's reliable, it's an integral part of America's energy grid right now, and it can continue to be that and more as we continue to transition to clean energy, right? I have everything ready, and I promise you, if you ask any nuclear engineer about what they do and why they do it, they will talk for 3 hours nonstop. And you guys just gave me a microphone. I'm so sorry, okay? I won't go for 3 hours. But before I could finish 3 words of that, to this gentleman, he was walking off saying some unkind words and making some unkind gestures. I'll let you guys figure out what that means. Now at this point in time, I'm 17 years old. I finally found something I cared about. I finally found something that I was ready to bring to the world, to do good, to make it a better place. I was ready to make a difference. And that one gentleman scared me a lot. If that's how I get treated for caring, then I don't want to be treated like that. Now, my infinitely wiser 17-year-old brain looked at this gentleman who was of the older generation and said, "You're going to die in 20 years anyways. Why should I even bother talking to you? Have a nice life. Count your days." That was literally like how I responded in that situation, which I'm not proud of. That wasn't the right response. And honestly, from that point forward, I just didn't talk about nuclear to anybody of the older generation in America. I talked about solar and wind because it's sunshine and rainbows literally, and I was like, fine, we'll just keep it easy, right? I avoided the tough conversation. I avoided having that moment of, how can we come to a compromise here? I stopped talking to an entire group of people. Now I continued on with my life, for another 6 months, and I ended up becoming Miss Wisconsin in June of 2022. Now, one thing about being a state title holder, congratulations, you guys are going to learn about pageantry tonight, is you become it's a full-time job, right? I would be requested to go to different festivals. I'd be crowning, little princesses as the Festival Midwest Fair Supreme Queen of Corn, stuff like that. I'd be handing out cranberries. I stood in cranberry marshes and helped Wisconsin harvest their cranberries, like all sorts of stuff. That is that. But then you'd also get requested to come and talk about your social impact initiative to a bunch of different places. So I'd go to state legislatures. I'd actually have spoken internationally about nuclear energy at this point in time. I continued to have these conversations with people. And now I'm going through my requests one day in August of 2022, and I see an event request come in. It's at a nursing home. What's a nursing home full of? Old people. We can all say it. It's okay. All right? Now I go through and I call up my director. Brenda is her name, right? And Brenda is the woman who only wears tans and blacks. She's very cool, composed, collected. Okay, and I call Brenda and I say, "Hey Brenda, I saw this come in. I'm assuming they just want me to play my violin and like talk about Miss America and all that good stuff, right? Like, it'll be fine, it'll be a piece of cake." And she goes, "Oh, no, they requested that you talk about your social impact initiative." I'm like, okay, sounds good. We'll talk about solar and wind, it's fine, no big deal. Good stuff. And she goes, no, Grace, stop. I sent them your resume and your social impact statement, which is a resume, had Grace Stanky, nuclear engineering student, and then the social impact statement is a 3-page paper basically about how awesome I think nuclear energy is and how I plan on helping aid the transition in America to creating more nuclear energy, right? Whether it's power uprates, subsequent license renewals, or new builds. All of this stuff, right? And in my mind I went, how am I getting out of this one? And I couldn't figure out an answer. I couldn't figure out a way out of it. So I decided, you know what? Let's do this. Let's talk about nuclear. So I brought everything I could to that presentation, including the weird corner of YouTube that I end up on at 3 a.m. So I don't know where you end up on YouTube at 3 a.m., but I end up on dry cask spent nuclear fuel testing. That's normal, right? So I bring all of those videos, which, by the way, dry casks, that's where we store our spent nuclear fuel, which is usually what people are asking about when they say, what about the waste? The spent nuclear fuel is the uranium oxide pellets that have gone through a reactor. They've created electricity. And then what? They've done that for 3 cycles. Then they go to the spent fuel pool, they sit in a fancy little pool of water, and they cool down for a little bit, and then they're put into these dry casks in America. And they're stored on site at nuclear power plants right now. These dry casks are not very fancy, they're just giant concrete cylinders. That's it. But it's still incredibly important that they're strong, and they're resilient, and they shield. So the testing process of this is they put these cylinders on a train track actually, and they're about 20 feet in diameter. And they send a train hurtling at that dry cask at full speed ahead. Literally. I'm not kidding. So I show them that video and that presentation. We go through and we talk about how nuclear waste, this spent nuclear fuel, can actually be reprocessed. It can be recycled. You can reuse 90 to 95% of it and put it right back into a nuclear reactor. You can reuse another 1 to 2% of that remaining 5% to go into mixed oxide fuel. That's not talked about enough. And this isn't a science problem. This isn't a theory. Because reprocessing is happening in France, it's happening in India, it's happening in Russia, and it's about to start happening in Japan. When it comes to spent nuclear fuel, it is not a science problem, it is a policy problem. And I cannot emphasize that enough. So we talked about that for a little bit. Now the second biggest question I get about nuclear energy is, well, what about the safety? What about Chernobyl and Fukushima and 3 Mile Island and all of these things? And when it comes to safety, I want to give you a little bit of insight into what it's like to working in nuclear power. So throughout my college experience, I went through and applied for a co-op, which is basically a glorified intern. Because COVID happened and I had, everything happened, I basically was panic applying to anything and everything I could get because I needed a job to pay for school. And I applied for this and I got it. And it was in the nuclear fuels group at Constellation. Now, one of my tasks was to create a low-power physics testing simulation. The goal of this was that the simulation would be used in all 12 of Constellation's nuclear power plants. And I did it. As a 17, 18-year-old girl who got into this field out of spite against her father and barely had a clue what was going on. I made the code. I have a question for you all. Would you trust a 17-year-old girl who got into this field out of spite against her father who has no idea what she's doing to create a code that's going to get implemented into 12 different nuclear power plants?
Yes.
Oh my God, you guys are so kind. Because I don't. I was the 17-year-old girl. I did not trust myself at all. I said absolutely not. This is not going into that much, dude, no, seriously. So my confidence level was like 20%. I'm like, yeah, the code works, but does it work for a nuclear power plant? I don't know about that. So I call up my mentor, Jason. And Jason is the most patient guy in the world. Say, okay, Jason, what do I do here? How can we get this into a place that we're all more comfortable? And Jason goes, okay, Grace, well, here's a bunch of different tools that we have that we've learned from our past experience, a bunch of checklists and procedures that I want you to utilize to review this. Additionally, I want you to go to the World Association of Nuclear Operators, WANO, and find some operating experience of things that are similar to this, that went wrong in the past, and how we can learn from those things. Because every single thing that has gone wrong in the nuclear industry is in that wonderful little database. And we can pull those lessons learned. And we're required to before every single task we do. So I pull some lessons learned, and I go through all these procedures and these checklists, and I spend a good 4 weeks reviewing this code at this point in time. I'm trying to break it in every way possible. The input for it wants a number, I give it fish. It's fine. We'll figure it out. And after 4 weeks, I feel comfortable. Not confident, comfortable. My confidence level goes from about a 20% to maybe a 60 to a 70%. And I call up Jason. I'm like, okay, Jason, what do I do now? What's the next step here? Because I still am not comfortable with this going into plants. He says, okay, send it on over to me. I'll take a look at it. And my mentor does a review of it using different procedures and different checklists and different processes. So it's not just him repeating what I did. It's him taking a different avenue to try and do a same extensive, intense review. And he goes through and says, okay. He probably spends, I'd say, another 3 weeks on that. He says, okay, this looks pretty good. In my 17-year-old mind, I'm like, yes, I know something, I've learned, look at me go. Felt really good. But he goes through, he sends it to our boss then, and my boss does another review of it using different resources, different checklists, different procedures, all that good stuff. He says, okay, looks pretty good. And then he sends it to someone completely outside of our group that doesn't know my name, doesn't know who I am, and doesn't know what I do, but understands what this code is going to be used for. The goal of that is to remove the bias of who did this project. And that person does a review of it. So we've gone through 4 extensive reviews for one product now. And at this point in time, we all sit down on a call together, and we look at this and we say, okay, looks good. But what is worst case scenario if this doesn't work, and are we ready for it? Until the answer to that question was yes from every single one of us, and from the people at the sites that would be using that software, that code was not going to get implemented. Nuclear safety is held to the highest standard. One of my favorite things about bringing people to power plants, to tour them and to see them, is they kind of get irritated, not for the reasons that you think, but because we require people to hold a handrail when they're going up the stairs. Because people are held to that level of safety, 3 points of contact at all times. And because of that, I went through and decided, you know what? How safe is nuclear actually? What am I getting myself into here, right? And do I need really good health care, or where am I at in that situation? So I go through and I actually pull up all of the OSHA reports, so the occupational safety and hazards and all that good stuff. So anytime a workplace incident happens, it gets reported there. And I look at the stats for every single industry. Does anyone want to take a guess as to how many industries are safer to work in than nuclear energy? Okay, I love all the zeros. I wish it was 0. But I'm going to tell you what's safer. Accounting. Data analytics. And there's 4 other similar desk jobs like that. So that's what we're talking about here. There are only 6 industries safer to work in America than a nuclear energy job. That's pretty incredible for what a nuclear power plant is. That's amazing. And I love to hear that. Now I go through and I give this whole presentation to these people at this nursing home, and it's full of a room of about 200 people, so less than we have here. But I'm looking around in the crowd. I'm looking for somebody that's going, nurse, get me out of here. I'm done. This lady's a lunatic. I'm done. I looked out in that crowd, and I didn't see a single person doing that. I will admit, 2 fell asleep. I'll fully own up to that one. But not a single person was treating me in the way that I thought I would be treated. What happened afterwards was I thought I would be, okay, thank you guys, have a good evening, I'm gonna go home now. But I ended up staying for another hour, talking with that group of people, having further conversation about their concerns, about whatever else they may have. That was right around the time that Russia was invading Ukraine. So there were questions about what happens to a nuclear power plant facility that is in an active war zone and operators are being held at gunpoint while they're operating. How is that safe? We've got tons of international bodies like the International Atomic Energy Agency that step in moments like that. That has been thought about. Now from there, I'll never forget that day because those conversations are some of the best conversations I've ever had. You know, I love talking to kindergartners and politicians, but stimulating conversation is nice every once in a while. So I think that one transcends international boundaries here, guys. Like, you know, really. Anyways, but that day was amazing. And I'll never forget because as I'm walking out, you know, my home state where I was representing Wisconsin, it's got a bit of like an alcohol problem, if I'm being honest. And at this nursing home, it's like 1 p.m. There's a group of 6 or 7 old ladies. The bar cart is rolled out. They've got their Bloody Marys. They've got their mimosas. I said, you know, if I end up in a nursing home, I want to be there. All right. But I'm walking out, you know, I'm saying bye to everybody, you know, thank you so much for having me. And this one lady stops and grabs me. And I'm standing there like this. You know when your grandma would grab you by the arm and it's cold and it's bony and you feel it creeping throughout your body? That was that moment. That was that moment. And I looked at her and I thought, this is it. This is going to be the moment when I have that reaction that I was looking for in the audience. But this woman looks at me and she goes, Grace, we are so honored to have you represent the state of Wisconsin, and we cannot wait to watch you become Miss America. Now, I don't know if that same group of old ladies cast a spell or have like an underground betting ring or something, because 4 months later, I became Miss America. But what I never forgot about that moment was the kindness that she showed me, the patience that she showed me, the care that she showed me, the questioning attitude that came from that group of people. I've heard that nuclear might be a little bit of a heated discussion here in Australia. I'm willing to guess that some of you in this audience disagree and don't think we should have it. The important thing here is civil discourse. Have a questioning attitude and ask those questions. But how about we start with asking each other's names first? Because you're talking to another human being. That's the most important thing here. That's something that we need in America too, for a lot of different things. But the one thing that's amazing about nuclear in America is it's actually a bipartisan issue. At the federal level, the ADVANCE Act was passed in 2024 with a nearly unanimous vote in Congress. That's unheard of for our Congress to agree on anything. On anything. That goes to show that compromise can be reached. Discussions, conversations can lead to productive end results. So when I ask you to practice that questioning attitude, I'm excited to have the opportunity to connect all of you with your local Australian nuclear experts, because you have the expertise here in Australia. You have the knowledge here in Australia. You don't need to bring in an American. I just like to tell stories, right? That's where I'm at. But you've got the knowledge here. So with that, I'm thrilled to move into the panel portion of this evening and have our incredible panelists come up and join us. Thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate it.
Please give it up again for Grace. Thank you. This now takes us to our panel discussion. Grace will be joined up on stage by a series of Australia's best nuclear experts to discuss nuclear power and how it could work in an Australian context. Later, there'll also be a Q&A where we'll be answering the questions that all of you sent in, and I promise you there are a lot, plus the questions that you send in throughout the evening using the QR code or the link up on screen now. Obviously, there have been, I would probably easily say, over 100 questions sent through, so unless you want us to stay here for a few more hours, and you know, I'm sure Grace is very low on sleep, so that we'll see how that goes. That might be a tough conversation, but we will try to answer as many questions as we can, but obviously we can't guarantee we'll get to all of them. I'd now like to start by introducing tonight's panel. First up is Mark Schneider. Mark, like Grace, is from the United States. He holds a bachelor's degree in nuclear engineering technology and has 23 years of nuclear power experience. Across his career, he's operated 8 nuclear reactors for both the US Navy in their aircraft carriers and submarines, and Dominion Energy at the Surrey Power Station. He's now based in Perth and was recently announced as UBH Group's Chief Nuclear Officer. Please welcome Mark to the stage. Next up is Kirsty Braybon. Kirsty is a nuclear lawyer who leads the nuclear law program at the University of Adelaide and provides expert advisory services through Braybon Advisory. Previously, she served as the inaugural head of legal for the Australian Radioactive Waste Agency and as a special advisor to the government on AUKUS-related matters. Please welcome Kirsty to the stage. And last but not least, Jasmine Diab. Jazz is a nuclear security specialist with decades of experience in the Australian nuclear scene. During her 22 years of active service in the Australian Army, she provided operational and training support in countering chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive threats. She has a Master of Nuclear Engineering, is the Managing Director of Global Nuclear Security Partners Australia, and is the President of Women in Nuclear Australia. Please welcome Jasmine Dean. Now, all of those intros take a very long time because, as you can realise, these guys are experts and have huge bios, so apologies for the time that took. Now, I wanted to start by doing the panel discussion and then we'll go into the questions. First up, I think it's really important that we bring it back to a Victorian context specifically and the energy debate we're having here in Victoria and how nuclear energy could potentially play a role. Jazz, could nuclear energy work in Victoria and what is the current energy debate we're having here?
So Victoria actually provides a lot of the East Coast's power and energy. There are a lot of other states, South Australia, New South Wales, Tassie, that rely on the energy that's produced out of Victoria, predominantly out of the coal industry. And so as we move to transition to cleaner energy sources, that gap of energy production is actually providing instability and unreliability of that system. And so it's really important that we get this East Coast National Energy Market, or the NEM, that we get that right because there's so much that hinges on that energy system. And we get more demands of energy for things like AI and data centres and the manufacturing sector. So being able to provide some baseload power to that grid is super important. And nuclear is a really great way to transition away from coal, still have renewables. The energy should be a mix. It shouldn't be 100% of one energy source, but allowing something that can provide that reliability and stability to that grid so that a lot of people get clean and reliable energy.
And I think the thing that isn't said enough is that nuclear is actually more than clean, reliable electricity to the grid. It actually has a whole different range of applications, and obviously there's nuclear medicine. There are a lot more, such as the use of process heat. And I was wondering, say, if Mark or Grace, if you could expand on that, all of the different applications which exist, which make nuclear energy an even more interesting solution for Australia.
Yeah, so the process heat is one of the big ones where you can take, and they're doing this in China, where you have a city that needs heating throughout it. So instead of converting to electricity, sending it, and then using that through electric heaters, you can actually just send the steam directly out. The other thing is we hear about carbon capture technology. I can take during low demand periods when I have high supply. I can use that to then extract the CO2 from the air to create. Essentially, it's not fossil fuels because it doesn't come from the ground, but create hydrocarbons that we could use to power cars. You can also have hydrogen gas. So there's lots of other applications you can use nuclear energy for.
And I think that's what really makes it an interesting solution, is that not only it can provide that benefit to the grid, particularly here in a Victorian context, but there are those other uses which I think are far too often missed in the debate here in Victoria and, to be honest, more broadly around Australia. Now, I think it's then important to have a look at what's going on around the world, because 32 countries currently have nuclear power. Approximately 50 are looking at it for the very first time. So there's a very different discussion happening about nuclear power overseas, and I think it's important that we in Australia reflect on that, because ultimately the global experience is probably going to inform what actually ends up happening here in Australia if we were to lift the ban and get some action happening on nuclear energy. And first, I think it's appropriate, we've got two Americans sitting on the same couch over there. So I wanted to start off with the United States, because obviously they've got the most reactors of any country in the world, and there's a lot of action happening there currently. So for instance, Grace, you mentioned the Advance Act. There was also the declaration that they will be tripling nuclear energy capacity in the United States, which obviously means a lot of investment in nuclear energy. So Grace, what is happening in the United States at the moment, and what is there to learn from the US's experience?
Yeah, I think one of the easiest things in terms of nuclear growth is the obvious solution of building new. So that's like the easy one to jump to. And there's a lot of different conversations going on in America right now about that, with new types of technologies like small modular reactors, and all sorts of different stuff. But the other part of growing nuclear capacity that isn't known or isn't talked about enough is things like power uprates. And when I say power uprate, that means these plants that were built in the 70s, they're creating a lot more electricity today than they were in the 70s because they've been able to modernize, because they've been able to make upgrades to the power plant, because we understand how to optimize these reactor cores better. We've also been able to lengthen cycles from something like a year out to 2 years, potentially even 2.5 years. So there's so many different ways to grow and expand nuclear once it's established there. We're seeing that with these existing plants. And additionally, you know, one of the other exciting things that's happening in America is we're restarting reactors that have been recently decommissioned. So actually, the one that is, I think, most popular globally, I'd say, is the 3 Mile Island restart. So unknown fact, but not most nuclear power plants have more than one reactor on site, right? So when I say 3 Mile Island, there are 2 reactors on that site. There's the one that had the partial meltdown in 1979, and then there's one that continued operating until 2019, and it was one of the best performing reactors in America. Now, about 5 years after it was decommissioned in 2019, Constellation announced that there was a power purchase agreement with Microsoft to restart this unit. So that unit is coming back online as the Crane Clean Energy Center to create electricity for data centers. And that's something that we have got such an intense amount of load growth and load demand that we need to accommodate for. And nuclear, through these power upgrades, subsequent license renewals, and potentially building new, that's how it's going to be done.
And I think something which, unfortunately, we had Craig Scroggie speak with us on the panel in Brisbane last night, and for background, he's the CEO of NextDC, which operates, I think it's 13 data centers around the country, and he's one of these people speaking about AI, and that's obviously quite a big of the origin story for this new renewed interest in nuclear energy in the United States at the moment. But he was very clear in his support of having all options on the table, including nuclear energy, for that reason. Now, the next example I want to go to is thinking about the UK. Now, Kirsty, in particular, was recently in the UK. She was actually pregnant at the time with her son, Flynn, who I've had the chance to meet, and I'll let you know, Kirsty looks totally normal, so he's very cute. So I'm not sure if he got some, that cuteness from the being in the vicinity of those nuclear power stations. But just to reflect, I guess, more seriously on your experience in the UK, obviously the UK is returning to investing in nuclear at the moment. There have been some hiccups, there have been some challenges, and I'd appreciate the insights that you got on that trip there.
Yeah. So I had the opportunity to go overseas for work last year, and I travelled through Asia and then into Europe and then into the UK to go to some nuclear projects. And what resonated with me in particular in the UK, and I went to an operating power site as well as a site under construction. For me, what resonated was more about the social impacts in the community and the kind of region building that comes from some of these projects. And what did shock me was the lack of opposition. And I think part of that is, the UK has been a nuclear capable country for a very long time. They've got a very long history of it. So they're a lot more maybe nuclear aware than maybe like a country like Australia. But, talking to, the teams at these locations, they were like, oh no, obviously there's people in town that, don't like it, but the majority are really for it because it creates a lot of jobs, it adds a lot of money to the economy. The local supermarket has to be open more hours, has to have more stock, we've got to put on more shifts. So it was really more about how positive these local communities were to have a workforce and job opportunity and economy that would last for such a long time, because they've had industries come into their towns, but they come and go, and we know that the construction phase in these projects often has an influx of people, and then it dies sort of off to your operating staff levels, and then you go through your decommissioning or closure. It might be a mine, might be a solar farm, something like that, right? But something with nuclear, it's got such longevity in the project. So, these communities start to see, I don't have to just, build up my local IGA for this many years. No, it's going to be decades that my supermarket is going to be operating at this level. So they see a lot more opportunity in that. And I went to one site in particular that the plant was being decommissioned. And they told me that their biggest issue with their staff was lack of morale, because from a personality perspective, people weren't going to work every day to generate power. They were going to work every day to decommission the power. So they didn't feel like they were adding to their community in the same way anymore. And I just found that was a really interesting perspective, looking at these really big major projects in the UK. But yeah, and I mean, like I said, Will, you know, well, you've met my son, lives it. So yes, he is completely normal, and he's very cute. He's 3 months old, and he's travelling with me on this trip. And you know, we went to a medical test reactor in Asia. I went to a nuclear waste facility in Europe. I went to an underground nuclear lab 600 meters below the surface, to where they test the radioisotopes. On the geology, went to a power plant. I also went to a naval base and stood next to a nuclear powered submarine with ballistic missiles. And hands up in the room, where do you think I was exposed to the most radiation? The flight, yes, exactly.
Wow, and I think we've all had that same experience. Obviously, Grace, you'll be accumulating a bit of radiation by the end of this trip, so hopefully you're all good by the end of it, and sorry for whatever we'll have done to you. So next, the final country I want to focus on. Well, look, the other interesting thing is Grace will be actually visiting Parliament House in Canberra, and my understanding is because of how that's actually being built.
The granite.
Yeah, the granite in Parliament House. You actually get more radiation standing around Parliament House, and who knows, it might be for some other reasons because of the contents of what's in Parliament House. But it will be very interesting. We're going to have a dosimeter, and we'll test it ourselves. Where will she have more radiation? Will it be Parliament House, or whether it'll be a nuclear plant? I think that'll be a very interesting experiment for us to conduct. Now,
Grace, remember, as low as reasonably achievable, time distance shielding.
Yes. Well, we might have to manoeuvre her around quickly around some politicians then. Now, finally, the final country we want to have a look at is South Korea. Now, Jazz, you were recently in South Korea touring some nuclear facilities, and I was wondering, what were some of your key insights from that trip, noting that South Korea is a country with quite a mature nuclear industry?
Yeah, so the South Koreans are probably one of very few countries in the world that has continually built reactors and hasn't stopped that industry. So for the last 50 years, they have been building domestic power plants, and for the last 15 have started exporting globally. And so they are responsible for the Baraka plant in the UAE, which was built to budget, on time. In fact, some of the later plants were online, some of the later units were online earlier than scheduled. So the Koreans have been able to do this because they understand the energy security problem in their region. They are an isolated grid. They're almost like an island. North Korea has zero connections to them, as you can understand. So they are completely self-sufficient and reliable. Like Australia, we need to be as an island. So for their energy security part, they knew that nuclear was a way that they would reliably be able to have power and energy to support their industry more than anything, industry and manufacturing. And so they can produce every single component for their nuclear power plants, less fuel, and that's a security and safeguards limitation, which as a nuclear security specialist, I'm like, that's a good thing. They can produce it all themselves. In fact, it's to a point where a lot of other nuclear vendors look to South Korea to produce their reactor pressure vessels because they have the biggest metal forge in the world. It is, we saw it, and it is huge. Very, very cool. If you're into big machines, it is cool. YouTube it, very awesome. And so what I really learned from the South Koreans was what you can do if you have reliable energy security yourself. You can build all these industries and be completely self-sufficient as a nation.
Now, thank you everyone for continuing to send all of your questions through. I've been reviewing some of them that have been sent through, and we'll be getting to that in a moment. How I wanted to conclude the panel discussion is talking about, you know, what would it actually take for us to have nuclear in Australia? And I think to start off, I think think a lot of people assume we'd be starting from scratch. And that isn't necessarily the case. Yes, we have a ban on civil nuclear power, but we already are deeply involved in nuclear science and technology. And again, Jazz, if I'm able to go to you, what does Victoria and Australia more broadly have going for in terms of nuclear energy and technology?
Yeah, so Australia is a nuclear nation. We have been for the last 70 years. We have run 3 research reactors in Australia at Lucas Heights, which is about 30 kilometres out of the Sydney CBD. That is where the majority of our nuclear medicine is produced, and that nuclear medicine is shipped all around the country as well as internationally. There's only 3 reactors in the world that produce some of the medical isotopes that are produced in the O4 reactor at Lucas Heights. If ever you travel to Sydney, go visit their visitors centre. It's pretty cool, especially if you're a nerd like me. So we've done that, and to have that research reactor run safely, run securely and effectively, we have regulators that have been stood up. We have the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, which is based here in Melbourne. They are responsible for making us safe from radiation. And it's not just around the reactor. If you're a radiation safety officer at a mine site, at a hospital, at so many other industries, they make sure that you stay below the legal limits for radiation exposure. We also have the Australian Safeguards and Non-Proliferation Office based out of Canberra, and it makes sure that every ounce of Australian uranium is not put into a weapons program. They track to the gram where every bit of uranium goes. And if a country buys our uranium, they have to report everywhere it goes until it is disposed of. And that's to make sure that we as Australia are responsible to make sure nobody can produce weapons from the materials we export. And so we have well-established industry. I'm very passionate about getting young people into the industry, so I love seeing all the young faces in the audience. Come talk to me about nuclear jobs. So we're not starting from scratch. We have expertise.
Well, we've been mining since the 50s.
Yeah.
Like South Australia, my home state, we've been, Radium Hill, been mining for that long. And we all know AUKUS was announced a couple of years ago as well. So we're about to acquire nuclear powered submarines.
And Kirsty, the next question that I had specifically for you, noting your background in nuclear law, your work with the Australian Radioactive Waste Agency, is say if we started today and the bans were lifted, how long would it actually take to have nuclear in Australia? What would actually be required in terms of regulation and
From
all
law
of those other
perspective,
different
yeah.
steps?
Yeah, not a lot, to be honest. Because the ban is your biggest step, right? We've got to get rid of that first. If you're really going to have a discussion about it, the ban needs to be lifted at the Commonwealth level, and that has been done in part already. It was done like 2023. I was going to say last year, but it's not last year anymore, is it? Happened in 2023 for the nuclear powered submarines, and that just got snuck through Parliament and no one really noticed. But when it comes to what else we would need, like Jazz said, we've got the radiation regulator. Their piece of legislation, their act would have to be amended. They have there's a prohibition in there that would need to be removed, but they would need some minor adjustments to expand the licensing scheme. But it's not material, it wouldn't take a lot. The legislation that underpins the Safeguards Office doesn't need amendment at all to deliver this. So you've got safety, you've got security, we've got safeguards, and the other one would be nuclear liability, and so the government would have to come up with a model for that. We've already signed the main international treaty for nuclear liability anyway, so one of the options would be to ratify that and create it as domestic law in Australia. But, that's not leaps and bounds either, because Australia has to do that anyway to come up with something for AUKUS. So, the game changer here, especially in the law aspect, is that, we had plenty in place already for civil nuclear, for the medicine side in Australia. AUKUS has come along, which is quite hard to deliver from a legal point of view in Australia. So half the work's done. So delivering it from a legal point of view is not hard. It's not going to take long. I've heard people talk about saying it's going to take 5 years to get laws up. Nah. They could get those amendments drafted and through Parliament. they definitely could be into Parliament within a year. Politicians, God knows how long it takes them to get through the Parliament. You can't control them. But honestly, the actual work is not hard.
And I would say on top of it, the Australian Nuclear Power Safety Regulator is already covering a lot of those items that are lacking in the existing framework.
Now, I wanted to move on to the audience questions. Like I said before, thank you everyone for sending so many questions through. We obviously also had a lot of questions sent through in advance of the evening. We will do our best to cover all of the topics which have been addressed. I'll make sure to ask this panel the hard questions that you guys have all sent through. We think it's important that your concerns about nuclear power are raised to the panel, but of course there will be an opportunity at the end of the event if you wish to speak to members of the panel, if you feel that your concerns have still not been addressed. The first question we've had submitted in is from Martin. Big scientific organisations have come out to say it is too expensive and won't work. What is the actual proof that nuclear does or doesn't work? If I could maybe ask that to Jazz and maybe Grace if you also want to compliment.
Yeah, so I think from a scientific perspective, the technology works. It has for 70 plus years and it's been fine. I think what Martin might be referring to is the CSIRO's Gen Cost report, which is often flouted about by politicians as talking about how much it costs for electricity. The secret is actually in the name here, Gen Cost. It is about the cost of generation for electricity. So this is actually a report for people who want to build electricity generation systems, solar farms, wind farms, nuclear power plants, about what is the cost to actually build and get that producing electrons on a grid. It does not give us what is the cost to the consumer at the power point. That does not exist. That report does not exist at all. So nuclear will always be the most expensive when you talk about the cost of generation because it has very high upfront capital costs. The cost benefit for nuclear power to consumers is in its lifetime, where it lives for 60 to 80, and the DG of the International Atomic Energy Agency has recently proposed that some of these modern reactors can live for 100 years and be licensed out that long. Nuclear power plants have a very low operating cost because fuel is not that expensive in the big scheme of things. The big costs in operation are on humans running the power plant, doing the maintenance cycles. That's where the cost is in nuclear operations, compared to solar, wind, which have very low capital costs, but need constant maintenance and renewal every 15 plus years. So that's Gen Cost report. Cost of generation, if you're a secret billionaire and want to invest, that's the report you look at if you want to set up a farm. What we really need as consumers is a full system cost review that tells us what is the cost to generation plus transmission and distribution, so we know what we're going to pay when we use electricity. Now this is hard to model, right? And a lot of people don't want to put the money forward to those smart economic modelers to do that for us, because the US released a report last year, Department of Energy released their liftoff report, and it did this analysis for the Californian grid. Californian grid's very similar to Australia, heavy renewables, I think about 80% renewables in their grid, but they have support from gas and nuclear lying as their base load. This report highlighted that it was 37% cheaper to consumers when nuclear was part of that grid than when it was running off 100% renewable. And so I think that is quite telling when you talk about nuclear energy being thrown into the energy mix. So as consumers, we want to know what the cost is at the power point. We don't care about the generation because we're not the ones investing in building that. So I think that hopefully answers it. The technology for nuclear is proven. The science is there. The economic modelling for us as consumers does not exist in Australia, and we should be asking for this.
So I can give you a real world example for Dominion Energy. They have a mixed fleet of wind, solar, gas, coal, and nuclear. From a profit margin, they sell all their kilowatts at a standard rate. They have an 11% profit rating for nuclear, 7% for natural gas, 4% for coal. Wind and solar, they sell at a loss and are subsidized by the American taxpayer.
Or the Australian taxpayer.
And Grace, is that your experience as well in the United States, that nuclear has helped drive down power bills?
Well, I think it's the Nuclear Energy Institute in America did a study on all of the communities that have nuclear power plants in them. And one, I think it's totally unrelated to the point, but of the question, but those are actually the people that most support nuclear energy in America, is the people that live near the plants. But the whole point of the question here, it's 6% cheaper for your electricity in those communities that live near those nuclear power plants.
And I think that's quite profound. Now, the next question is from Mark. Don't worry, it's not from Mark Schneider. But the question from Mark that was sent through is, do we actually have the capability to build reactors here in Australia? And Jazz, I was wondering if you'd be able to answer that for us.
Yeah, so I think our best example is the Opal nuclear power plant. I think it's about a decade old. It was built by Australians, Argentine design. So we were given plans, the design for that reactor, and it was built in 9 years. And yes, there were certain parts of the construction industry that had to upskill for portions of that, but it has been done in Australia. We are really good at mega projects, except Snowy Hydro. I won't talk about that. But we have a big industry, and it doesn't take much to upskill that industry to do that. We can learn some lessons from our friends in the US. I think Vogel is a really good example. They took a first of a kind type of reactor. They hadn't built reactors in a long time. They took a design that wasn't quite ready yet. The regulator influenced a lot of design changes, which blew out the budget and blew out the time scale. Compare that to the South Koreans, who took their reactor design 99% complete, ready to license, and were able to build on time, on budget. So I think a lesson we can learn here is we need to, when we pick a technology, pick a design that's complete, not a design that's half completed. Pick a design that's licensed somewhere else in the world so the regulator understands the licensing conditions, and then allow the industry to upskill and thrive, because that's something we can do in Australia.
Now, the next question we've got is from Glenn, and it's about nuclear waste, which is obviously a concern that a lot of people have. What is the plan to store or recycle power generation waste? And I was wondering if I could ask that of Kirsty. Obviously, it's a complicated topic, and there's multiple kinds of nuclear waste.
Yeah.
Grace and I have had the benefit of visiting one of those facilities, so I might ask Grace if you could then follow up on Kirsty's comments.
Yeah, well, I mean, we obviously don't have a plan for recycling nuclear energy waste at the moment because we don't have nuclear energy, but what I can tell you is what we do with our waste currently in Australia, because we do have waste. Jazz has talked about the Opal reactor in Sydney, and that's where our largest chunk of Commonwealth waste comes from. But we also have a lot of waste that comes from the mining industry, medicine, agriculture, oil and gas. So they all make up what is our waste inventory within Australia. In particularly with Opal, that does produce some high-level waste that is immediately sent overseas. You heard Grace talk before about recycling, so that's something Australia does. So currently, Australia generates high-level waste, but we do not hold any high-level waste. So what we do is, as soon as we have generated it and it's gone into its cooling ponds for a while, we then send that over to France. They reprocess it, and it gets reused again. And what we get back is these big TN81 canisters. So like you heard Grace talking about the big canisters. So we get those back. I don't know if anyone that saw the news in Sydney from a couple of years ago when it came into the port and we shut down half of Sydney, driving it through with the police and everything. This thing's huge, right? And I don't know if you've seen any of Will's pictures where he's hugging them. But that's essentially what happens with the very, very little high-level waste Australia has. And then we have an inventory of intermediate level waste, which is also quite small. All of that at the moment is stored temporarily at ANSTO in Sydney, because the federal government has been trying for many decades to find a location for a national waste repository, but we know that's quite a sensitive topic. But what we do have, and which is the site that Grace and Will went to and we've been to as well, is there's a low-level it's a hazardous waste facility in Western Australia. It's just a couple of hours outside of Kalgoorlie, and it is licensed to take low-level radioactive waste. And it's a near-surface geological repository, and they take a lot of Australia's low-level radioactive waste today. So that's kind of what our policy is in Australia at the moment. There is some uncertainty as to whether the federal government will still pursue a national facility, especially now in light of AUKUS, because we will now need to deal with AUKUS waste as well. And Defence have announced that they are doing an assessment of defence land to try and find a location for a repository on defence land. So, we may end up commingling civilian waste and defence waste, but we don't have a policy position on that right now. But I can tell you that, waste is around us everywhere. It's about 100 different locations in Australia. It's in your hospitals and your universities. But, it's completely managed. You're not exposed to radiation as you saw with Will. You can hug a canister. So, yeah, that's sort of where Australia is at in their waste.
I think to just add on to that about Sandy Ridge, it was really cool seeing that. That was my first time in the outback. I did not see any kangaroos. So I saw emus. Yeah, I did see that. So I was super excited. But one thing that is important to talk about here is the permanent geological repositories, right? What does a permanent solution look like? In Australia, you guys are really lucky because you've got the geology, you've got the stable areas, the no groundwater there in an area like Sandy Ridge. So a permanent geological repository is very possible here in Australia for that storage. And I just want to kind of circle back to, you brought up AUKUS and the waste. I know, Mark, how much waste is that actually going to produce? Let's talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, so a submarine that operates for 33 years will produce about one wheelie bin that you put out on the verge each week per submarine. So that's all you have to manage. We're not talking large quantities from a submarine perspective.
Now, the next question I want to focus on is in terms of safety. And Mark, the first question from John, and I'll also then incorporate one of the questions we've been sent through Slido in a moment as well. There's a few questions around safety, and I know it's a sensitive topic, so I think it's important we spend some time on it. First of all, from John, what are the key technology and design differences between nuclear plants built today versus the past?
Oh, that is a great question. So the plants in the past lacked what's known as passive safety, meaning that the reactor will, using nuclear physics or using natural physics processes, become just stable. So the reactors, say in Fukushima, had hours to respond, and when they lost their cooling, before they would melt down. When you look at like the AP1000, it's been extended out to 72 hours, and some of the new designs have unlimited passive safety. And you actually see a lot of that with the AUKUS submarine reactors. They actually don't require a whole lot of operator intervention from a safety perspective. Some of the other things that have occurred is that in the United States in the 90s, they actually identified that the issue that occurred at Fukushima was a real possibility of flooding of your emergency switchgear. So they installed station blackout diesels. If Diablo Canyon had undergone the same type of accident that occurred at Fukushima, she would have been offline for a couple of months while they recovered, based on the fact that the station blackout diesels going through normal switchgear, they would be able to keep the reactors cool. They'd had to clean up the salt water that was in their emergency switchgear and could have brought it back online. After Fukushima, the world, to include the United States, added in what's called BDB Flex, which are separate equipment that can be installed. Some is held on site. Some have 24 hours to be heavy lifted in with helicopters into the sites. We're talking bulldozers, we're talking diesel-driven pumps. There's a lot of equipment that is on standby, and that is a standard that the IEA, the International Atomic Energy Association, requires if you are going to operate these power reactors.
I think one to add, so the Opal reactor in Sydney, I know I drum on about it, it's beautiful. If you ever get a chance to visit it, it's lovely. It has passive safety. So if anything was to happen, they can shut that down and it can keep cooling forever. They can walk away and it'll be completely fine. And so I think passive safety is such an important safety feature built into modern reactors.
And you talked about like minimal intervention, right? Just to illustrate that, like what we're getting for AUKUS is your reactor core in a black box that we can't open, right? So you can't intervene with it because you don't need to.
Yeah,
That's
that's true.
That's fascinating, and I actually didn't personally know that until you guys just mentioned on the panel. So thank you, I just learned something. And it's always great being in the presence of all of these guys because you certainly do learn a lot, and I hope that's something where you're picking up on during tonight's event. Now, to continue with the questions, the next one I've got has been sent through Slido. Can nuclear power projects morph into nuclear weapons in countries with insecure borders? So this is a proliferation question, another really sensitive topic. Jazz, or maybe Kirsty, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so nuclear fuel that goes into power plants is often low enriched uranium, potentially high assay low enriched uranium. The reason that is because we don't want it to be weaponizable. To create a nuclear weapon, you need high enriched uranium, which means it has been sitting in a centrifuge for a long time. It is high levels of uranium-235. If you want to go into more of the chemistry, I'd happily talk to you for about 3 hours about it. But that's why old reactors used a lot of high enriched uranium. Part of the non-proliferation treaty was to get commercial power reactors to non-weaponizable fuels. So you'll see there's a lot of research in fuels to make it more effective and efficient in the reactor, but also non-proliferation. So you will look at low enriched, which can't be weaponizable. A lot of people talk about, well, what if someone got access to a power plant and took the fuel out of the reactor and then turned that into a weapon? First of all, they'd be dead, because spent fuel is really hot, really, really hot. That reaction, that physics is amazing, but it creates so much heat, which is what helps us produce the electricity, that if a person went there to get it, they would die. And if they did manage, let's say they had some superpowers, they had a lead-lined suit and they were able to get a hold of it, once they've got that fuel, it's got so many fission products that has contaminated the uranium and plutonium mix in there, but they actually can't remove that material to then turn that into a weapon. So there are so many chemistry features of nuclear fuel that are in place to make it really, really hard to turn that into a weapon. So that's a really great question, because I know that concerns a lot of people. A lot of people conflate power and energy nuclear with weapons, but there's a lot of strict guidelines that it makes sure that bad people don't get their hands on good material.
And there's a legal framework around this as well. So, you know, Australia has signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, so an international treaty. Australia is part of that, as many countries in the world are. We've committed to be a non-nuclear weapons state, which is a pretty big deal at an international level. And then from there down, Australia has entered into what's known as a Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the additional protocol. And what that does is it creates a regulatory framework with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which allows them to do inspections and come and audit what we do in Australia. Jazz was saying before about that we know where every piece of nuclear material is, but that also relates to nuclear technology. So it's not just the material, like we know where all the special lasers are and all those sorts of things, don't we? There's a lot of things that the Atomic Energy Agency does, alongside our Safeguards Office in Australia.
I'm sure that's something that we can't be privy to, but
So
it'd be interesting.
I do want to add in from a U.S. perspective here. So the U.S. has 94 operating nuclear reactors. They do not make the plutonium necessary for weapons. They're not capable of doing that. The United States built in the 1940s special reactors in Washington State for generating that plutonium. Those special reactors went offline. The U.S. is still using all the same plutonium for their weapons program that was produced back then. There's no new plutonium being generated in the United States for weapons.
Now, Mark, I've actually got a question myself for you, and apologies, this was meant to be an audience Q&A, but does anything actually scare you about nuclear power?
One of the things that's fascinating, right, and I can use like as a coal plant as an example. So anybody who works at a power plant, you're going to be operating high energy systems, air, steam, you're going to have potential electrical systems and potential for fire, right? So I would have to wear steam suits for some of the things I had. I had to wear big firefighting ensembles. I fought fires at the power plant, had a truck blow up, or had a truck catch on fire, had electrical fires. Had to wear a big suit whenever I had to rack in breakers, right? Those are the things that scare me, those high energy systems. They exist in switchyards, they exist in coal plants, they exist sometimes in hospitals, they exist everywhere around us. What I had to wear for protective clothing, for radiation protection, was a paper suit. And it was only there so that the dust wouldn't get on me and I didn't track it around and expose you to it. That's the only reason why I wore it, was to prevent exposure to you, the public.
Wow. Now, the next question, I'm just checking if we had, as I feel like there's another one. Oh, it was to Kirsty, and this is from Rose. This is actually about your trip to the UK, Kirsty. Were there any extra safety protocols and restrictions due to your pregnancy during your visit to nuclear plants in the United Kingdom?
No, and that surprised me, to be honest. Because, you know, when you're pregnant, you're told you can't have certain scans and you can't be exposed to certain radiations when you're in the hospital, things like that, right? X-rays and so on, right? And so, and they say you can't do all these if you're pregnant, certainly, and you not drink alcohol and don't eat all the delicious, lovely things. But no, I was actually quite shocked by that, to be honest, because every site I went to, I told them in advance I was pregnant, being full prepared that I'd be, you know, given different set of rules. No, not at all. And that was because they explained to me that, well, no, you're not actually going to get exposed to any radiation while you're here. And I just, because I've been to some sites in previous years where they'd given me like just dosimeters to have on me, and I just assumed I had the dosimeter because I was going into an area that was going to expose me to radiation. And they were like, no, you just have them for safety reasons. It actually doesn't mean we're exposing you to a higher level of radiation at all. The worst part about it was just trying to walk around these sites pregnant. I was about 20 weeks, so it was hard work.
I might add to that because I am pregnant at the moment and visited the power plant in South Korea and visited a decommissioned plant out at Ansto, which is probably the most radiation I've been exposed to. But because I'm a nerd, we had a Geiger counter with us, and there was more radiation in just background radiation outside the power plant than what I was exposed to inside the power plant. And that's due to all the shielding that's in place from the reactor core. We stood next to the spent fuel pond, which had spent fuel in it. We were looking at it through lead-lined glass. And so those safety features to protect the workers that are there for hours every single day are so good that they've almost blocked out all the radiation that you've got more in background than on the site.
So for the U.S., for nuclear power plant workers, there's an exposure limit that we can't exceed 200 millisieverts per quarter. For a pregnant woman, they have to report that, and they can't exceed 100 millisieverts for the entire pregnancy. And so when a nuclear power plant worker that is pregnant is working, they have a reduced exposure limit. So if they're going to be going in the containment and doing work, they have to minimize the amount of radiation they have as a precautionary measure.
Now, the next thing I want to talk about is workforce, and I think the great thing here is that we've got many of you who've actually worked in the nuclear industry. Certainly Grace now works in the industry. Mark has, you know, you've been operating nuclear reactors, I think it's for 23 years. Not anymore, but hopefully soon you'll be operating some in Australia. But I've got two questions, and I sort of want to combine them in one. One was pre-submitted from Chris. What do you see as Australia's biggest challenges in developing our own sovereign nuclear-trained workforce needed within the right time frame? And the second is from Trevor, just sent through. If you could also provide an answer of, like, what is the scale of this? And Trevor specifically asks on Slido, how many jobs would be created if Australia was to go nuclear?
Yeah, I'll kind of jump in here. So this may come as a surprise, but most people at a nuclear power plant do not have a nuclear engineering degree. There's really only about 5 or 6 like true nuclear engineers at a site. You may have 10 to 12 then working like off-site to do core design or something like that. Most of the jobs at a nuclear power plant are systems engineers and knowing their systems. You've got nurses testing fitness for duty. You've got managers. You've got communication specialists. You've got firefighters. Like it's truly a small village at a nuclear power plant. During normal operations, there's about anywhere from 600 to 1,000 employees, I'd say, at a nuclear facility. And then during outage season, which is the refueling time, so when the uranium is being switched out and new uranium is being put in, new fuel is being put in, that site can grow up to 3,000 employees during that time. So the point here is that there's a lot of transferable skills that can move into the nuclear industry, right? And what's even more awesome is usually they'll pay for you to go and get upskilled as well. So it's just really, I love the jobs that nuclear energy provides, because it's not just jobs for you, it's jobs for your kids and your grandkids as well.
So when I retired from the Navy, I went and I started working at Surrey Power Station. They were getting prepped for an outage, and so when I first reported, they have a training area that's outside of the secure area of the plant. And there was all these outage workers. Some, they were just part of the outage circuit. They worked at nuke plants all over the place, even from Mexico. And then there were a bunch of guys that it was their first time at a nuke plant. They'd work at hydroelectric plants. They'd work at coal plants doing outages. So their skills as mechanics, their skills as operators, their skills as cleaners really did translate. Working at Surrey Power Station, I know of at least 2 father and sons that dads got hired on as operators at the power plant out of high school, worked their way up to senior management, to include the plant manager, the second highest position at the power plant. Sons worked, both sons started as janitors, cleaning, became operators. Tyler Paul is a licensed operator, no college education. He's now making $330,000 Australian a year in his mid-20s.
Oh.
Wow, I'd like that job.
I don't make
So,
that
maybe I'm pursuing this for selfish reasons.
Hey,
Now, 3
Will,
more questions.
Just
First-
Will,
yes,
because
Kirsty.
Grace just talked about like the operating phase and when you were refueling.
Yeah.
But you went and visited Hinkley Point C, right, in the
Yes.
UK. So what was the workforce numbers on a construction site that day?
So it was funny. So the construction director there is an Australian, and I asked him that question. 13,000 people were working there building that nuclear power plant, and it was funny because the majority of that workforce was a union workforce. I spoke to them. I spoke to one lady who I think had something like 3 generations of her family working at that power plant. And Kirsty, I know you talked about attitudes, across the UK and nuclear, and that's exactly what I picked up on. It is so funny because I also got the chance to hear from the UK's equivalent of Chris Bowen, Ed Miliband, who's in UK Labour. It was so funny. Look, we're a non-partisan organisation, so I'd be very careful with my statements, but he sounded more like Ted O'Brien than he did Chris Bowen when I heard him talking about nuclear energy, and for a lot of reasons that got me a bit confused. I was a bit disorientated, and we had union leaders. So that's, no, thank you for bringing that up, Kirsty, because it's fascinating in the UK.
Talking about numbers, so Surrey County in Virginia is not very big. It's only got a population of 6,000 people. So when you're doing an outage and you have an additional 3,000 people, that is totally boosting that economy. That county runs off of Surrey Power Station. Everything runs off of that. And they're not, they don't have a whole bunch of housing. There's literally cornfields where they have hookups, and people bring their caravans out to go work at the site. So there's a whole outage community. There's a whole outage group in the United States. They go from plant to plant doing these outages in their caravans.
Wow. Now, I did say 3 more questions, and because of my rambling remarks, I have realised it's clocked over 7:30, but I want to get to these last 3. First from Petra. Should the plan for nuclear in Australia include small modular nuclear reactors?
I'm happy to answer that. Yes, because I come from Western Australia and our grid is very small, vulnerable, isolated, and a big 1,000 megawatt nuclear power plant would probably overwhelm that system unless overnight we built a heap of data centres and big industry. On the East Coast, I think large-scale nuclear is a good option for the East Coast grid. However, every energy plan that I've ever heard mentioned completely forgets the north of Australia, which is still heavily reliant on a diesel grid. And so there's a lot of communities up there that just don't have reliable power and energy, and if trucks can't get up there in the summer, in the wet season, then they just don't get that electricity. So I think that the north of Australia is also a really great place for either small modular or, my secret girl crush, micro reactors, which is still a little bit away off, but I think as long as it's a fleet and it's not one of every kind, you can then have that reliability of building that system. So I think a mix of power generation would be great in Australia.
can I nerd out a little bit here?
Yeah.
So one of the
Yes.
cool things about small modular reactors is pressurized water reactors, which is what we're talking about mostly. They have what's called a negative temperature coefficient of reactivity. Really fancy term.
What?
But when that number is big, you can ramp your reactor rapidly. And the smaller the reactor, the bigger that number is, right? So big reactors are slower to ramp. Small reactors can ramp rapidly. And I say this having served on submarines, some of the smallest of reactors. I can go from 0% power to 100% power very quickly. I can't tell you for classified reasons, but I'll tell you it's a couple of minutes as opposed to 90 minutes.
Which is good to support the renewable grid. I think that's the
Yes.
important part to say. So you can ramp it up when the sun's about to go down so that you don't have a disconnection in energy generation. That's why ramping is important.
Now, 2 more questions, and they're actually fun questions. Now, first from Sarah. If you could say one thing to the Prime Minister, what would you say? And Grace, I would note that we are going to Parliament on the 5th. All politicians have been invited, including the Prime Minister. Let's see if he agrees to meet with you. But what would, I guess, Grace, is focus on you. What would your message be to the Prime Minister? Hopefully you can deliver it in person, but let's see.
Nuclear is safe, it's clean, it's effective, it's reliable, and it builds strong communities.
Right. And the last question. The last question is from Peter, and his question reads like this. I'm 11 years old. How can I get my friends at my school in country Victoria educated about the positives and negatives of nuclear energy?
That's a great
Peter's
question.
He's
Very
so much
impressive.
wiser than I was.
Yeah.
Like, did
Where
you
is
just,
Peter? Is
yeah.
Peter here? Well,
Hey, Peter, come get my card.
I
we'll
think,
see if he's here.
I
Who
think
knows?
there's a lot
But
of
we'll provide the answer still for Peter. It's being recorded,
Yeah.
so we'll be able to share it with him.
So I think there's a lot of really great things here. So Nuclear for Australia last year released some fact sheets for free. You can download them. There's one that talks to the safety, security and safeguards of nuclear power. There's one that talks about just nuclear technology in general, gives you almost a 101 on nuclear. And then there's one that talks about waste. There are future ones coming through that will
Yes.
talk about prices and the environment. But these are free, and we've tried to write them in a way that anyone can digest that information. So if you download it and it makes no sense to you, we want to know. Because it is important to give everyone good information that they can understand rather than all the high technical stuff and you walk away going, that's batshit crazy. So, sorry, I shouldn't speak to 11-year-olds. So I would say, do that. There are also some great videos on YouTube from places like the International Atomic Energy Agency, the US Department of Energy. They all release great videos that talk about what nuclear power is, what nuclear technology is, and you may end up on a YouTube spiral like Grace and start watching spent fuel canisters being hit by rockets at full speed, which is cool.
I'll add on to this for Peter, 11 years old, right? I don't know about Peter, but when I was 11 years old, reports were not exactly my nighttime reading material. So one thing that's really cool is social media has the ability to educate people, connect people. I guess this is weird because like I make nuclear content on social media. So my primary platforms are Instagram and Facebook and things like that. But there are a ton of other people that do it as well. And the one thing that I'm saying here is not like, follow me, I tell you everything. I don't want people to only follow pro-nuclear people. Invite the other side, understand what's going on. Like, don't just make an echo chamber. Like, I highly, highly recommend, especially for young people, social media is such a powerful, powerful tool to allow us to connect with people from all across the globe with different perspectives and different experiences. So get that full picture. Like, the biggest thing that I would recommend is put yourself out there and learn as much as you can, because you can never stop learning. Never stop learning.
And this is why we need young people on the panel, because I went straight to read a report.
And there's speaking of YouTube, there's a great non-biased person. He talks about all sorts of things, science, Kyle Hill. And he goes into some crazy detail on the accidents too, right? And one thing that I think that people, when they talk about nuclear, is they're worried that nuclear advocates are not, or they're afraid to talk about the accidents. I will talk to you about every accident if you want me to. You can come up to me afterwards. I'll talk to you about Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and I'm going to bring one up in front of everyone, SL1, the actual worst nuclear accident in the United States that killed 3 people. And I can tell you the actions that were taken that kept me safe as a nuclear operator operating on submarines my entire career that have been implemented because of that accident.
Wow. Now thank you to Grace and the panel, because I wanted to wrap it up now. I said at the start that we respect everyone's time, and I'm conscious that we're running I was about to say 7, now 8 minutes over time. So again, my apologies for that. This now takes us to the conclusion of tonight's event. We really do hope that each and every one of you enjoyed it and took away something from it. Grace and the other speakers will be up here for around 30 more minutes if you want to take some photos, if you want to ask the panel questions, and we'd encourage you to. If you do not feel that your concerns about nuclear energy have been addressed, you've got a lot of expertise between these 4 speakers, and I think they'd certainly welcome the opportunity to answer your questions. We will be closing the doors at 8 o'clock sharp. We are conscious that Grace and some of the other panel members are very sleep deprived at the moment. Hopefully it wasn't displayed here this evening, but we are conscious of our health. Now, finally, if you missed out on getting any merchandise, you can find that at the back of the room. If you'd like to support our People Powered campaign, and I thank you to each and every one of our supporters in this room who helped this tour go ahead, please go to nuclearforaustralia.com. Your contributions do make a difference. They meant that we were able to put this tour on, and obviously we think it's really important that Australians have access to the facts and information surrounding nuclear energy. So with all of that said, with all of my rambling, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoyed it.